Before we jump in, please note that this episode of Paper Lives will feature discussions of sensitive topics such as bigotry, homophobia, and execution. Thank you for listening. Hello and welcome back to Paper Lives, the podcast where we peel back the decaying pages of long-forgotten newspapers and journals to find fragile stories and bring them to life once again. Today we will take to the high seas of 1809 and meet naval surgeon James Nehemiah Taylor. This otherwise unknown figure speaks through the fragile and hostile pages of the past, providing a vital and rare glimpse of homosexual self-understanding in an environment of silence, repression and elimination. It was a cold winter morning on Portsmouth Harbour. Upon the calm yet icy waters sat HMS Jamaica. Although Christmas was only 2 days prior, the feeling on the ship was far from jubilant. The crew lined the deck, waiting with bated breath for the moment to pass. The shivering figures looked up to the yardarm, today playing the part of the gallows. Many of them wondered why and how the surgeon they had trusted with their lives could commit such an act, and to claim it was natural? No, this was the right way. Or was it? Doubt may have swirled in the minds of some of the crew members.
Is this truly what a forgiving and loving God would want?
Is this how we are to be repaid after so much sacrifice?
Some minds may have turned to their own immortal souls, seeing in the surgeon a reflection of their own selves and their own nature. They would now know that the ship was not a safe place. There he was. The crew gazed in disgust as their former comrade was taken to his final judgment. Well, some of them did anyway. Others would have looked with trepidation and thought,
that could be me.
The crew could now see him vigorously shake the hand of the pastor. Well, it truly is in God's hands now, many of them privately thought.
God bless you,
came the surgeon's calls as he climbed to his doom. Within just a few minutes, it was done. James Nehemiah Taylor was dead. Taylor's execution was widely reported across the British and Imperial press. His crime was
an abominable offence,
claimed the Lancaster Gazette.
A crime against nature,
according to the Kentish Weekly Post. And it was performed by what the Bristol Mirror described as a
wretched man.
What was Taylor actually guilty of? Why was there such willful silence from these reports? Half a year before, and half a world away from that fateful morning on Portsmouth Harbour, the HMS Jamaica set sail from the Canadian port of Halifax. It was the 23rd of August, 1809. Sailmaker John Harris later recalled the day.
I had been covering a gun rope in the place of paddings. I carried the rope into the after gun room betwixt the hours of 3 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon. On my doing so, I saw 2 boys and a marine. They were laughing. I asked them what they were laughing at. And one said, "Come here, and I will show you." Accordingly, I looked through a small hole that is cut in the corner of Taylor's cabin. I saw Taylor and Thomas Ashton, his servant.
What Taylor and Ashton were doing is left up to the imagination of those reading the London Globe newspaper. The particulars that Harris detailed are nowhere to be found, but the readership would have known. This unspeakable crime was sodomy. Same-sex physical relations. Such criminalisation of homosexuality dates back to Henry VIII's Buggery Act of 1533, and from then until 1861, the punishment for such act was death. The legal framework around such immoral acts was deeply steeped in an austere Protestantism. Even the word sodomy directly evokes the morally bankrupt biblical people of Sodom, destroyed by God for their impropriety. The foundational jurist William Blackstone wrote in 1765 that in the case of sodomy,
the voice of nature and of reason and the express law of God determine it to be a capital offence. I will not act so disagreeable a part to my readers as well to myself as to dwell on it any longer.
He, along with the entire legal profession, saw homosexuality as
a crime not fit to be named.
This religiously inspired culture of silence explains why the newspapers were so coy in detailing Taylor's acts and even naming the crime that he was accused of. It also makes it quite hard for us to reconstruct queer lives from this period, as defendants increasingly were suppressed both from speaking at sodomy trials and having their words reproduced in either the popular press or the official record. In the case of James Nehemiah Taylor, we have a unique case where extensive reporting followed from an interest in Royal Naval conduct. The culture of silence exerts influence, but through the euphemisms and exclusions, we can see a man tortured by his own self, caught between his own natural inclinations and the rules of the austere society around him. James Nehemiah Taylor was 39 years old when he died, serving for 19 years as a surgeon in the Royal Navy. Such a role would have earned Taylor a great deal of respect amongst his colleagues, and a fine salary for his trouble. For the last 6 years, he would have been burdened with the casualties of the Napoleonic Wars, as the HMS Jamaica patrolled the Channel and made a number of transatlantic voyages. We do not know much about Taylor's life beyond this one snapshot, but he apparently presented a terrific character. Fellow surgeon John Martin declared that,
"I've known him 18 years. He's always bore an excellent character, and I've always found him a very respectable young man."
The HMS Jamaica's captain, Arthur Lysat, added that,
"Prior to this unfortunate business, I considered his character as a very good one."
all Taylor could call upon in his defence was assurances of his good character, an attempt to show this as a momentary lapse. It was to no avail. That most unspeakable of crimes could not be forgiven. The court was cleared out, and the judge called out,
"This court is of the opinion that the charge has been proved against the said Nehemiah Taylor, and does adjudge him to suffer death by being hanged by the neck on board such ship of his Majesty, and at such a time as the Lord High Admiral of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland should direct."
Between the years 1690 and 1840, at least 345 people were prosecuted by the Royal Navy for homosexual acts, averaging around 2 prosecutions a year. What then made Taylor's case unique? Well, as we noted before, it was common practice to exclude the voices of those accused of that unspeakable crime. Yet in Taylor's case, an extended report from the Hampshire Telegraph provides a vital link to a forgotten voice. Could this be that his position as a surgeon at a vital juncture in British naval history, i.e. the Napoleonic Wars, was of public interest? Was it to do with his position on this ship? Was it to do with public scrutiny of the Navy at such a vital time? It's quite difficult to say for certain, but we should be grateful that the papers even decided to record any of this in the first place. So, with that, let's return back to James Taylor's final hours. During what should have been a jubilant Christmas day, James Taylor prepared to be launched into eternity. At such a dark hour, one Reverend Howell came to lecture Taylor on his immorality, and Taylor spoke to him at length.
"I feel myself now, sir, perfectly prepared to receive any instruction you think proper. This world is disappearing before me, and another is arising to my view, which demands my attention."
Despite Taylor's immortal soul being at the forefront of his mind, he did not yet see his actions as sinful or wrong.
I consider man a free agent sent into this world, and I look upon God as a merciful being who will make allowance for human frailty. He would not be so severe in punishing for the indulgence of passions which we were implanted in our nature and constitution.
Taylor saw his own homosexual inclinations as natural, implanted in him by a God that granted him free will to act on those inclinations. It was not a moral shortcoming to him, but an inherent and unshakable part of himself. Taylor had conceptualized his own homosexual proclivities within his own Christian beliefs. To Taylor, his Christian beliefs were completely compatible with his own proclivities, with his own sexual identity. And being able to create a Christianity, a Christian framework of theology that fits within one's own sexual identity is something that one might not think is even possible at this time. But Taylor shows us that a self-accepting theology was and is possible. This self-affirmation did little to please Reverend Howell. "If it had been my option to sign your death warrant, I should not have hesitated a single moment in determining to carry the sentence pronounced on you into execution." Unsurprisingly, Taylor did not accept Howell's offer to spend his penultimate night on Earth debating theology, but the words of the Reverend and Taylor's imminent death, according to the newspapers, launched Taylor into a spiral of self-doubt and denial. In the morning, he apparently spoke to Howell again.
Sir, I am willing now to make a disclosure of all my sins, for I feel I must unburden my heart and mind of them. I will tell you with whom I have been concerned in this hateful crime, which I have practiced so long and so often, and who are the persons that have tended to bring me into this baneful practice. Sir, this crime is more general than you are aware of. There is a society formed for the practice of it.
Taylor's worldview had been utterly shattered. His outward belief that he had nothing to be ashamed of seemingly crushed under the weight of religious guilt. There's a clear sense of desperation that Taylor would give up the names of others like him, people who he had loved, he had been with, that he had found comfort in the arms of. The Reverend, however, did not want names. He did not want recollection. Only that Taylor should reject his former self before his final judgment.
In London, in France, and in the Mediterranean, I've seen the crime committed, and it was not considered a crime. Having taken up with that same opinion, that I had a right to do with myself as I pleased, and that I was not accountable to God.
The last vestiges of self-acceptance that Taylor once had were publicly extinguished by the dampening force of guilt, dogma, and imminent death.
I now loathe myself. I see my detestable nature and cry unto God for a pardon of all my sins.
Under Howell's compulsion, Taylor slavishly devoted himself to the scriptures in his final hours, taking part in the Eucharist and attentively listening to Howell's pointed service on Sodom and Gomorrah. When he climbed to his doom the next day, Taylor's mind would have been a muddle of guilt, desperate piety, and self-denial. At least, this is the perspective given by the Hampshire Telegraph. There were no sympathetic pages to relay Taylor's actual thoughts, no diaries left to us to dissect, no unpublished manuscript. Taylor's life is passed to us through hostile pages. His final recanting of his apparently sinful past is a perfect narrative. It consolidates a powerful message. There can be no deviation. There can be no heresy. We will never know if Taylor truly recanted his past life. We will never truly know his mind. Whether he went to the gallows sure in his belief that God made him as he was, or was launched into oblivion, a muddled mess of contradictions and guilt, is sadly something we cannot take from this paper life. Despite this tragic end, Taylor's final reflections here tell a wider story, that an individual could believe that they had a right to do with themselves as they pleased, that they could square their own self-identity within their own theology, We find in Taylor an echo of Enlightenment individualism, probably coming from his apparent interest in Voltaire, Bolingbroke, and other infidel authors. These infidel authors were to become foundational in liberal thought, and the belief that an individual's acts, as long as they cause no harm to others, cannot and should not be punished. Taylor had for many years taken comfort in the arms of other men across Europe, shared in the belief that their feelings and selves were natural, implanted in them by the divine. There is then a kernel of hope in this tragic life, that out of a culture of silence, death, and suppression, a rudimentary queer self-understanding and self-acceptance could still flourish. There was space for a homosexual Christianity. People could, did, and would identify their own selves with their faith, with their God. That they could see their own acts as natural and God-given. Although the press reports of his demise were overwhelmingly hostile, Taylor's voice still travelled through these reports. Some 200 miles north of Portsmouth lies the boring outer suburban road of Pennine Close, Wakefield. In 1810, the land was host to Doghouse Farm, worked by tenant farmer Matthew Tomlinson. Now, Tomlinson kept an extensive multi-decade journal, which was only recently rediscovered by local history researchers. Sandwiched between Christmas dinner recipes and musings on sheep shearing techniques, we find a reflection upon Taylor's case. I was this week sensibly affected in reading the behaviour and execution of a Mr. Taylor, serving on board the Jamaica. Tomlinson was confused but not disgusted by Taylor's sexuality. It appears a paradox to me how men should possess such a passion, and more particularly so if it is their nature from childhood. It must then be considered as natural, otherwise as a defect in nature. It seems cruel to punish that defect with death. It seems that Tomlinson had not actually considered the existence of male homosexuality before he read this article, considering it a paradox. Yet his belief that it was natural closely mirrors Taylor's own self-understanding, even if he does see it as a defect. It must seem strange indeed that God Almighty should make such a being with such a nature, and then at the same time make a decree that if he that God formed should at any time follow that nature, he should be punished with death. This is not a defence of homosexuality, however. Tomlinson, with only an austere Christian framework of sexuality to work from, still saw Taylor's acts as a crime, if not a crime against nature. As I should suppose that a man, if he was castrated, would neither have power nor feel inclination to commit such a crime a second time, and he might perhaps become a useful member of society. Now, at first glance, this might seem just as horrific as death, but we must remember that these are simply the musings of a distant farmer. The fact that such a figure even had the capacity to see homosexuality as natural, as something implanted in nature by God, and was spurred into such a thought through the power of the hostile press, shows not only the power of the press in preserving fragile voices that they'd probably rather stamp out, but that although the state and its legal framework may make no space for homosexuality, there is still space for private diversity of thought, action, and opinion. There is always more than just the official record. James Taylor was not the only person tried for his sexuality by the Royal Navy, as we've already discussed. Within the opaque, almost impenetrable private papers of Admiral John Jervis, 1st Earl of St. Vincent, we find a series of letters written in early July 1797, at the height of the blockade of Cadiz, Rather than being concerned with the wider war against Spain and its Napoleonic allies, Jervis detailed an attempted mutiny to the Secretary of the Admiralty, Evan Nepean.
My dear Nepean, a plan laid on board the HMS St. George on Sunday last to wrest the command of the ship from the officers, the pretext a determination that 2 men condemned to death for sodomy should not be executed on board that ship, has been frustrated happily. 3 ringleaders are held in the poops of our ships, and I think there is evidence to convict them.
Convicted they were. Executed at the ship's yardarm along with the 2 men they tried to defend. Control was soon exerted amongst the crew of the St. George, and they were all forced to fall in line, preparing for an assault on Tenerife. Although we do not know the names, the voices, or the lives of those executed, this footnote in the memoirs of the man who sent them to their doom allows us to see that sometimes crews could look past the legal and religious framework they were forced to observe. They were able to risk it all for their friends, comrades, and sometimes their lovers. If we delve into the trial papers of similar cases, we see examples of acceptance, indifference, and even understanding amongst crew and witnesses. In an 1807 trial of George Shandoff and James Johnson, those called to provide character statements provided and confirmed the loving words of one of the accused.
He told him that he loved him and that he would never hurt him and that he loved him with all of his heart.
In an earlier 1701 trial of a William Harris, one crewmate reported overhearing very kind expressions that the 2 men involved exchanged.
My dear, my life, my soul.
In an 1808 trial of George Putner and Michael Millard, a junior Marine called to testify admitted to seeing the 2 men kiss on multiple occasions.
I never formed any evil opinion of it. It was not until another Marine declared it inappropriate that I even saw it any differently. Even at that point, I still did not wish to get involved, and I left them alone because I did not choose to see more.
We can see within these forgotten trial papers not only evidence of acceptance and a recognition of the validity of same-sex love, but rare glimpses into how that love was actually expressed. There is a great irony that we can only know this through papers detailing the execution of those men, that the papers that sealed their fate are our only links to these fragile voices. They are the only way they can speak out against the world that they were trapped within. After the death of James Nehemiah Taylor, homosexual acts would continue to be punished with death until 1861, with the passage of the Criminal Statutes Repeal Act. Sexual activity between men remained illegal under penalty of imprisonment until 1967 in England and Wales. Yet it was not until the year 2000 that lesbian, gay, or bisexual people could openly serve in the Royal Navy. Recently, on the 19th of July 2023, the British government formally apologised for the systematic discrimination of LGBT people within the armed forces. We can only wonder what Taylor and those men convicted over that 150-year period would think of this. Would they think that it was just too little, too late? Would they be happy for those today who could share the love that they never could? Would they even see anything in common with those LGBT people serving today? They have a completely different self-identity and conception of their own sexuality. Well, this is all speculation. We'll never truly know. But we can recognise the strides we have taken, and we can continue the fight for the strides yet to come. James Nehemiah Taylor and a great many men paid the ultimate price for their sexuality. The pages that now preserve their lives did so to denigrate or to persecute, through the power of the state and the press. These pages would not exist without that persecution. The oppressor becomes a conduit for the voice of the oppressed. In the case of Taylor and others like him, these dark accounts can offer light if we try to find it, showing that throughout history, self-acceptance could exist, even when the weight of the state, society, and religion tried to crush any difference or so-called defects in nature. Thank you for listening to this episode of Paper Lives. It was written and performed by myself, Tommy Hanmer, with special thanks to our guest performers. We are also grateful to Richter Norton and his extensive queer history sourcebook. If you want to find out more about this topic, please go to our website www.paperlivespodcast.wordpress.com, where you will find an accompanying blog and links to further resources. Once again, thank you for listening, and tune in next time for another Paper Life.